All right, welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, great to be back.
So today we're going to dive deep into something that's developing really quickly. It's this whole clash between Maine's Governor Janet Mills and the Trump administration
Right.
over transgender athletes and women's sports.
Yep.
And it's honestly a story that goes way beyond just athletics.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we're talking about states' rights, federal power, even how Title IX is being interpreted in the 21st century.
Definitely.
And to really get into this, we've got a ton of different sources.
Yeah.
We've got news articles, official statements, there's some legal analysis out there. We've even got some social media reactions to get into.
I mean, and what makes this so fascinating is just what could come out of all of this.
Right.
You know, we might see a court case come out of this, Maine potentially losing federal funding, even just a deeper national divide when it comes to transgender rights.
Absolutely. And I think to start unpacking all of this, we really need to start with the No Men and Women's Sports Executive Order.
Okay.
So what exactly does it say and what is it trying to do?
Well, the executive order basically tries to prevent, transgender women from competing in women's sports at every level.
Wow.
Like high school, college, even professional sports.
So this is pretty significant.
Oh, yeah. And the Trump administration's argument is that it's about fairness,
Right.
and protecting women's sports and making sure everything's kind of even.
But of course.
But the critics, they say it's discriminatory.
Right.
And, a direct attack on transgender rights.
And this isn't just theoretical either.
No.
The NCAA has already changed their policies to match this executive order.
Right.
And then you've got Governor Mills, who very publicly and very strongly said, see you in court.
Yep.
At that White House meeting back on February 21st. So what was the reaction to that?
Well, that same day,
Wow.
the U.S. Department of Education started an investigation into Maine's Department of Education saying they violated Title IX.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very fast, very strategic move to put pressure on Maine right away.
Yeah, because it seems like instead of backing down, Governor Mills really doubled down. I'm looking at some of her statements here. They're pretty strong.
Oh, yeah.
She talks about her oath to uphold the Constitution, the rule of law. She even says no president, no matter what party,
Right.
can use federal funds as a weapon.
Yeah. I mean, she is absolutely framing this as the federal government going too far.
Yeah.
She's making it sound like a king or a dictator is trying to force states to do what he wants.
It's really interesting because, Governor Mills, she was a district attorney.
Yeah.
She's the attorney general.
Yep.
This is somebody who spent her career upholding the law. So to see her take such a strong stance, especially against a president known for being, pretty aggressive, it's fascinating. But this wasn't the only way the administration went after Maine, right?
Exactly. And that's where things get even more interesting because the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture,
Right.
they got involved too.
Okay.
And they started a compliance review of the University of Maine.
Now, I think most people would hear that and be like, wait, what does agriculture have to do with transgender athletes?
Right, I know. And that's exactly how they're trying to put the pressure on.
Okay.
Because the University of Maine gets over $100 million
Wow.
from the USDA because it's a land grant institution.
Okay.
So by starting this review, they're basically threatening to take away all that money.
So they're hitting them from both sides.
Exactly.
The state's education department and the flagship university.
Yep.
It's a two-pronged attack, both financially and politically.
Yeah, it's putting Maine in a really tough spot.
And they really made it clear they were serious about this.
Oh, yeah.
The Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, even put out a statement saying, and I'm quoting them directly, taxpayer dollars will not be used to support institutions that discriminate.
It's pretty clear what they're saying.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty serious threat.
It is. They're saying if you don't do what we want, you're going to lose funding, and that puts Governor Mills and Maine in a really tough spot.
Yep.
They have to pick between sticking to their principles and possibly losing money they really need for education.
That's a tough choice. And, we've talked about Governor Mills
Right.
and the Trump administration, but there's a lot of other people involved here.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Who else is speaking up about this, and what are they saying?
Well, you've got people like Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee.
Okay.
She's a Republican, and she's been really vocal about supporting the executive order. She says it's about protecting women's sports and making sure Title IX is being used the way it was meant to.
Right.
Which is to prevent transgender athletes from having what she sees as an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
And this is really important to a lot of people who think this is a huge deal.
And on the other side of this, what are people saying?
Well, you've got people like Governor Jared Polis from Colorado, He's the head of the National Governors Association, and he's said he wants everyone to be more civil and have better discussions in politics.
Right.
And while he didn't say it directly about this case, it shows that people are tired of all the fighting and arguing.
Yeah, it's clear there are a lot of different opinions about this.
Yeah.
And it's really caught up in all the political stuff going on. But let's focus on Maine.
Okay.
What's actually happening there? How are things playing out locally?
Well, this is where it gets interesting,
Okay.
because it's not actually the governor who makes the rules for high school sports in Maine. It's the Maine Principals Association.
Gotcha.
And they've said they're going to keep doing things the way they've been doing them, meaning a student's gender identity is what matters.
So they're not listening to the federal government.
Nope. They're basically saying, we're going to do what we think is right.
So you've got the state fighting the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And then local groups like the MPA saying, we're doing our own thing.
Yeah, it's like a whole bunch of layers of conflict.
It is, and it's not just theoretical either.
No, it's having real effects on people's lives.
Exactly. Are there any examples or stories from Maine that show how this is impacting people?
You know, the sources we have don't really give specific personal stories from Maine.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that behind all the legal arguments and political stuff,
Right.
there are real people.
Yeah.
Transgender athletes, their families, their schools, their communities.
Of course.
They're the ones dealing with all of this, and their stories are important too.
You're absolutely right. We need to hear from them too. Okay, so we've set the scene. We know the players, and we see what's at stake. Now, the big question is, what happens next?
Well, it seems like there's going to be a court case.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much guaranteed.
Governor Mills has said she's ready to fight.
Mm-hmm.
And the Trump administration seems like they want to force everyone to follow the executive order.
Yeah.
This could even go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
And that would be a really big deal for other states dealing with this, too.
And what happens in that case would have huge consequences, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like if Maine wins, it could make other states feel like they can stand up to the federal government too.
Exactly.
But if the federal government wins...
it'll be much harder for transgender athletes to compete all over the country.
And then there's the money issue.
Right.
Will Maine risk losing all that education funding?
Yeah, and will the University of Maine lose their USDA funding?
That's a lot of money to lose.
It is. This isn't just a threat. It could really hurt Maine's budget and its schools.
And this whole thing is part of this bigger fight about transgender rights.
Yeah, it's happening at the same time as a lot of other political and cultural arguments.
So even if you don't live in Maine or care about sports, this is still important.
Exactly.
It makes us think about things like individual rights, the power of the state versus the federal government, and the role of sports in our society. It's like a midi version of bigger fights happening everywhere.
It really is. It comes down to the question of who gets to decide. Who decides what's fair and what's right, and who gets to be included, and what happens when people don't agree with those decisions?
And this case really forces us to look at that question, doesn't it?
It does. It's not just about transgender athletes.
Right.
It's about how we as a society figure out all these complicated issues.
Yeah, it's about how we deal with different values and ideas.
And it shows us that we can't just ignore these tough conversations.
Right.
These issues are important, and we need to pay attention to them, think critically about them, and be willing to listen to different points of view.
It feels like this could have repercussions for all sorts of things where the state and federal government bump heads.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've seen it with immigration,
Right.
environmental stuff, but this case, it really highlights it.
Yeah.
Because it gets at those core beliefs about, what's fair,
Right.
what's right.
Loyalty.
Exactly. And the role of the government.
And speaking of those beliefs, it's interesting how this shows how political sports have become.
Yeah.
It used to be like sports were this thing that brought people together.
Right.
You could just enjoy the game.
Put all your differences aside.
Right. But now it seems like everything's a battle in the culture wars.
It's true. Sports have always reflected what's going on in society, but it feels like it's so much more intense now.
Yeah.
And this case really shows how those bigger arguments are ending up on the field.
Literally.
In the locker room, even in court.
So we've gone over a lot here.
Yeah, we have.
As we wrap this up, what's the main thing you want people to take away from this?
Well, here's something that wasn't really said in our sources, but I've been thinking about it this whole time.
I'm intrigued.
What does this whole fight tell us about how the relationship between states and the federal government is changing?
That's a good question.
Are we becoming more divided where states and the feds are constantly fighting for control over policies and even people's lives? This case about transgender athletes, but it might just be the beginning of even bigger disagreements.
That's kind of a scary thought, actually.
Yeah.
It makes me think about what Governor Mills said about presidents not being kings or dictators. It's about who has the power.
Yeah.
And who gets to decide what's best for people.
And these aren't just theoretical arguments either.
No.
They have real consequences for real people.
So there you have it, everyone. Our deep dive into this battle between Maine and the Trump administration over transgender athletes.
It's a fascinating one.
It is, and it's not over yet.
Not even close.
Lots of twists and turns to come, I'm sure, and we'll all be following along.
We will.
Hopefully this gave you some new things to think about as this develops.
Yeah, and remember, even if you aren't in Maine,
right,
or you don't care about sports, this still affects all of us.
Sure.
It reminds us to stay involved, stay informed, and keep asking those hard questions about who we are and what kind of future we want.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note,
we'll leave you to think about all of that.
Until next time.
Keep dosing deep.